The case begins on an ordinary winter day in Baltimore County. It is January 13, 1999. School is in session. Students follow familiar routines. Nothing about the morning signals what comes next. For many people involved, the day does not stand out at all. That normalcy later becomes one of the case's defining problems. If stories like this matter to you, consider subscribing, because what happens next shows how the justice system works when certainty is in short supply. 18-year-old Ha-Minute Lee attends Woodlawn High School. She is a senior. She has plans that afternoon. She is supposed to pick up her younger cousin after school. She never arrives. By evening, her family grows concerned. By night, the concern turns urgent. Ha-Minute Lee does not come home. At first, there is no clear reason to panic. Teenagers sometimes change plans. Friends assume she is busy. Teachers remember nothing unusual. There is no immediate sign of a crime. There is only absence. Police treat the situation as a missing person case. They begin with routine steps. They contact friends. They ask about her schedule. They retrace the likely path between school and the daycare center. Nothing appears out of place. There is no sign of a struggle. There is no abandoned vehicle. There is no eyewitness account of something going wrong. Among the people police contact is Adnan Syed. He is Ha's former boyfriend. They dated on and off. Their relationship ended weeks earlier. Friends describe the breakup as emotional but not violent. Adnan Syed cooperates with police. He speaks calmly. He answers questions. He says he does not remember anything unusual about that day. Memory becomes an issue almost immediately. January 13th is not a holiday. It is not a birthday. It is not marked by any event that would make it stand out. For Adnan Syed, for classmates, for teachers, the day blends into others like it. This lack of clarity later becomes central to the case. Weeks pass. The missing person investigation continues. Then, on February 9, 1999, a body is found. A passerby discovers human remains in Leakin Park, a large wooded area outside Baltimore. The body is identified as Ha-Minute Lee. She has been strangled. The case is no longer about a disappearance. It is now a homicide investigation. The discovery changes everything. Police shift their focus. They move from finding Ha-Minute Lee to determining who killed her. They return to earlier interviews. They re-examine relationships. Attention turns again to Adnan Syed. From the start, the case does not fit neatly together. There is no murder weapon recovered. There is no direct forensic evidence linking Adnan Syed to the crime scene. There are no eyewitnesses who see the crime occur. What exists instead is a collection of partial accounts and timelines that do not fully align. Investigators begin to assemble a theory of the day. According to this theory, Ha-Minute Lee leaves school shortly after the final bell. At some point, she encounters Adnan Syed. An argument follows. She is killed. Her body is later buried in Leakin Park. Her car is abandoned elsewhere. But each part of this sequence raises questions. Ha-Minute Lee is known to be careful about picking up her cousin on time. Friends say she takes that responsibility seriously. The window between the end of school and the pickup is narrow. There is little room for deviation. Adnan Syed's movements that afternoon are unclear. He attends school. He goes to track practice. He spends time with friends. None of these activities are disputed on their own. The problem is how they fit together, or whether they fit at all. Witness statements complicate matters further. Some people recall seeing Adnan Syed at certain times. Others are less sure. Memories differ. Details shift. What one person remembers confidently, another cannot confirm. These discrepancies are not unusual in criminal investigations. Here, they become critical. One witness emerges as especially important. Jay Wilds, an acquaintance of Adnan Syed, tells police that Adnan confesses to killing Ha-Minute Lee and asks for help disposing of the body. Jay provides details about locations and actions. His account gives investigators something they previously lack, a narrative. But the narrative is unstable. Jay Wilds' statements change over time. He gives multiple interviews. Each version contains similarities, but also differences. Times move. Locations shift. The order of events changes. Police note these inconsistencies but continue to rely on his testimony. Without physical evidence tying Adnan Syed directly to the crime, the case rests heavily on reconstruction. Investigators attempt to impose structure on a day that many participants cannot clearly remember. They turn to external data to do this. Among the materials collected are Adnan Syed's cell phone records. At the time, cell phones are not as integrated into daily life as they later become. Location tracking is limited. Records show calls made and received, and the cell towers used to route those calls. Initially, these records appear technical and neutral. They are lists of numbers and times. But investigators believe they can use them to anchor the timeline. If they can place the phone at certain locations at certain times, they believe they can support J. Wilde's account. At this stage, the case still feels fragmented. There are pieces, but they do not lock together cleanly. The timeline remains contested. The witness testimony is inconsistent. The physical evidence is thin. Even so, the investigation continues to narrow. Adnan Syed maintains his innocence. He says he does not remember the details of the day, but denies killing Ham-Minute Lee. His inability to recall specific movements is later framed as suspicious. Yet, at the time, it reflects a common problem in criminal cases involving ordinary days. As the prosecution builds its case, the focus begins to shift. The question is no longer simply who had motive or opportunity. It becomes how to make sense of conflicting accounts. How to choose which version of events to trust. The case moves toward trial with many uncertainties unresolved. What seems clear is that the story, as it stands, does not fully explain itself. The crime appears real. The loss is undeniable. But the path from the end of the school day to the burial site in Leakin Park remains difficult to trace. This is where the case pauses, balanced between doubt and accusation. The evidence exists, but its meaning is not yet fixed. The details are present, but they do not yet align. The investigation waits for something to bring order to the confusion. That turning point does not come from a new witness or a confession. It comes from how existing information is interpreted. From a detail that appears minor at first. A detail that promises clarity in a case defined by uncertainty. Investigators return to the evidence they already have. They do not look for something new. They look for something stable. Something that does not rely on memory or interpretation. Something that exists outside human recollection. That search leads them back to the cell phone records. In 1999, cell phones are common, but their investigative use is still developing. They do not provide GPS coordinates. They do not track movement precisely. What they do provide is call logs and the cell towers that handle those calls. Each connection leaves a record. Time. Duration. Tower location. To detectives, this data appears objective. Numbers do not forget. Towers do not change their stories. In a case full of uncertain timelines, the records seem to offer structure. Adnan Syed's phone activity on January 13th becomes the backbone of the prosecution's theory. Investigators align J. Wilde's statements with the call log. They look for matches. When the two appear to align, they treat those moments as fixed points in time. One call, in particular, draws attention. An incoming call in the early evening routes through a cell tower that covers Leakin Park. Prosecutors later argue that this call places Adnan Syed near the burial site at the time Ham-Minute Lee is buried. This becomes the final detail. The anchor. The explanation that makes the rest of the story appear coherent. From the prosecution's perspective, the logic is simple. J. Wilde says the burial happens that evening. The phone connects to a tower near the park at that same time. The phone belongs to Adnan Syed. Therefore, Adnan Syed must be there. Once this interpretation is accepted, other uncertainties seem less important. Conflicting memories become secondary. The lack of physical evidence appears less damaging. The case now has a timeline supported by data. But this structure depends on assumptions. Cell tower evidence does not show exact location. It shows which tower handled a call. Coverage areas overlap. Signals do not always connect to the closest tower. Network traffic can affect routing. These limitations are known within telecommunications, but less familiar in courtrooms at the time. There is also a distinction within the records themselves. Outgoing calls are logged differently than incoming calls. A disclaimer attached to the record states that incoming calls are not reliable indicators of location. This detail exists in writing. It is included in the documentation. At trial, this distinction receives little attention. The prosecution presents the cell phone evidence with confidence. Charts are shown. Timelines are drawn. Jurors are guided through the sequence of calls. The story becomes orderly. The day that once seemed confusing now appears mapped out. J. Wilds testifies again. His account still contains inconsistencies, but they are framed as minor. The core of his story remains. He says Adnan Syed shows him Ham-Minute Lee's body. He says they bury her together. He says the phone activity supports this sequence. The defense challenges Jay's credibility. They point to changes in his statements. They raise questions about his motivations. But without an alternative timeline grounded in data, their arguments struggle to displace the prosecution's narrative. Adnan Syed takes the stand. He speaks calmly. He maintains his innocence. He explains that he cannot recall the details of an ordinary afternoon weeks earlier. This explanation does not satisfy the jury. In a case where the timeline is presented as precise, uncertainty appears suspicious. The jury hears weeks of testimony. They see the cell phone records repeatedly. They are told that technology does not lie. They are told that the phone places Adnan Syed where he claims he was not. When deliberations end, the verdict is guilty. Adnan Syed is sentenced to life in prison, plus additional years. He enters the Maryland prison system as a young man. His conviction appears settled. The case fades from public attention. Inside prison, time moves differently. Appeals begin. Lawyers re-examine the record. They read transcripts. They review evidence that once seemed decisive. Years later, the cell phone records are scrutinized again. This time, not as proof, but as a question. Legal advocates notice the disclaimer about incoming calls. They examine expert testimony from the trial. They find that the limitation of the data was not fully explained to the jury. The final detail that once provided certainty now looks less stable. At the same time, attention returns to J. Wilds' testimony. Analysts compare his multiple statements side by side. They note how key details shift to align with the call log, not the other way around. Times change. Locations move. The story adapts. This reversal matters. If the timeline is shaped to fit the phone records, and the phone records are less reliable than presented, the foundation weakens. The case gains new life through public discussion. Journalists examine the evidence. Legal experts debate the trial. The question is no longer only guilt or innocence. It becomes whether the process itself functioned properly. Adnan Syed remains in prison as this debate unfolds. His daily reality does not change. Appeals take years. Court decisions move slowly. The system values finality. Reversing a conviction requires more than doubt. For many observers, the case now appears inverted. What once seemed to clarify the crime now raises new questions. The final detail that made the story make sense may have done so only because it was misunderstood. This shift does not provide an answer. It removes one. The cell phone evidence does not prove innocence. It does not prove guilt. It proves only that the certainty once attached to it was overstated. In a case built on alignment, that matters. As years pass, courts begin to acknowledge these concerns. Hearings are scheduled. Judges review whether key evidence was presented accurately, whether defense counsel challenged it effectively, whether the jury heard the full context. The system begins to examine itself. For Adnan Syed, this process is abstract but consequential. Each legal motion represents a possibility. Each ruling carries weight. His case becomes a lens through which broader issues are viewed. The case enters a new phase years after the conviction. Not through police work, but through review. Through distance. Through time. Inside the prison system, Adnan Syed's life follows a fixed routine. Counts. Meals. Work assignments. The conviction defines everything. Appeals are slow. Most fail. The burden is always on the convicted person to prove that something went wrong. Outside prison, the legal record becomes the focus. Attorneys revisit trial transcripts. They examine what was said and what was not said. They compare evidence as presented to evidence as it actually existed. One issue rises above the others. The cell phone records. At trial, the records are treated as location evidence. They are used to place Adnan Syed near Leakin Park at a specific time. This placement is essential. Without it, the timeline loses cohesion. With it, the prosecution's theory appears complete. But the more closely the records are examined, the more conditional they appear. The disclaimer attached to the phone records is not hidden. It states clearly that incoming calls should not be used to determine location. This is not a minor technicality. It is a direct limitation. The key call tied to the burial is an incoming call. During trial, this limitation is not emphasized. The jury hears expert testimony that suggests reliability. The nuance is lost. The evidence is simplified. Years later, legal experts view this as a problem. Not because the evidence is false, but because it is incomplete. Jurors are asked to rely on technology without being told where it fails. This issue intersects with another concern. Defense counsel. Adnan Syed's attorney, Cristina Gutierrez, is experienced and respected. At the time of trial, she is also dealing with health problems. In later years, she is disbarred for unrelated conduct. Her performance in Syed's case comes under scrutiny. Reviewers question why the cell phone disclaimer was not challenged more forcefully. Why expert testimony was not countered with clearer limitations. Why alternative interpretations were not presented with equal clarity. The legal standard is not perfection. It is effectiveness. The question becomes whether the defense met that standard. At the same time, Jay Wilde's role is re-examined. His testimony is compared across interviews, police notes, and trial statements. The variations are mapped carefully. What emerges is not a single, stable account, but a flexible one. Details appear to change in response to investigative pressure. Times shift to match phone records. Locations adjust to fit known facts. This does not automatically discredit the testimony. Witnesses can be inconsistent and still truthful. But the degree of alignment raises concerns. It suggests the timeline may have been constructed backward, starting from the data and shaping the story to fit it. Another detail draws attention. Jay Wilde knows where Ha-Minute Lee's car is located. This fact is significant. It is difficult to explain away. It suggests some level of involvement or knowledge. But even this detail becomes complicated. Questions arise about when Jay provided this information. Whether police already had leads. Whether the record fully reflects the sequence of discovery. As the case is revisited, it becomes less about proving an alternative story and more about testing the original one. Each pillar of the prosecution's case is examined for strength. No new physical evidence emerges. No confession is recanted. The facts of the crime remain unchanged. What changes is the confidence placed in the conclusions drawn from those facts. The case enters the appellate system in earnest. Hearings focus on specific claims. Ineffective assistance of counsel. Misuse of evidence. Failure to present exculpatory information. Judges review transcripts line by line. They do not retry the case. They assess the process. The standard is narrow. Even serious doubts do not always justify relief. In 2016, a judge grants Adnan Syed a new trial, citing problems with the handling of cell phone evidence. For the first time in years, the conviction appears unstable. The ruling acknowledges that the final detail may have been overstated. This decision does not declare innocence. It declares uncertainty. It recognizes that the jury may have relied on evidence presented without its full context. The state appeals. Higher courts weigh in. Decisions are reversed and reinstated. The legal back and forth continues. Each ruling shifts Syed's status without changing his daily reality. Throughout this period, public attention grows. Media coverage expands. The case becomes a reference point in discussions about wrongful convictions and evidentiary standards. This attention does not resolve the facts. It amplifies the questions. For people inside the justice system, the case illustrates a familiar tension. The desire for closure versus the obligation to accuracy. The difficulty of correcting possible errors once a verdict is reached. For Adnan Syed, the focus remains personal. Years in prison accumulate. The possibility of release appears and recedes. Each legal development carries hope and restraint. By this stage, the crime itself feels distant. What remains immediate is the system's response to its own work. Whether it can acknowledge limits. Whether it can revise conclusions when foundational assumptions are challenged. The story now stands at another threshold. The investigation has been revisited. The evidence reweighed. The process questioned. In 2022, the legal posture shifts decisively. Prosecutors in Baltimore review the case again, this time from inside the same system that once secured the conviction. They do not act under public pressure alone. They cite problems in the original prosecution. They identify evidence that was not disclosed to the defense at trial. Information related to alternative suspects. Notes that suggest other individuals may have had motive or opportunity. This evidence does not prove who killed Haminit Lee. It shows that the jury did not see the full picture. The state files a motion to vacate Adnan Syed's conviction. In court, a judge reviews the motion. The standard is not innocence. It is fairness. Whether the conviction can stand when key evidence was withheld and when critical testimony relied on overstated assumptions. The judge grants the motion. The conviction is vacated. Adnan Syed is released from prison after more than 20 years. For the legal system, this is not an exoneration. It is a procedural reset. The state has the option to retry the case. The burden shifts back to prosecutors. Weeks later, prosecutors drop the charges. They cite ongoing doubts and the interests of justice. Adnan Syed is no longer legally guilty of the crime. The decision does not answer the central question of who killed Haminit Lee. That question remains unresolved. What changes is the legal certainty that once attached to Adnan Syed. Reactions are divided. Some view the outcome as long overdue. Others see it as incomplete. The family of Haminit Lee expresses continued belief in his guilt and frustration with the process. Their loss remains unchanged by legal outcomes. From an institutional perspective, the case illustrates how a single detail can shape an entire narrative. The cell phone evidence did not create the case on its own. It organized it. It gave structure to testimony. It gave confidence to conclusions. When that detail is re-examined, the structure weakens. Not because every part is false, but because the alignment depends on an assumption that does not hold. The case also highlights the limits of memory. Of witnesses. Of defendants. Of investigators. Ordinary days do not preserve themselves. When the system demands precision years later, it often receives approximation instead. Within the prison system, Adnan Syed's release is rare but not unique. It reflects a broader pattern of re-examination in long-term convictions. Especially those built without physical evidence. Especially those relying on evolving interpretations of technology. The system is not designed to revisit old cases easily. Finality is a feature, not a flaw. But when finality conflicts with accuracy, tension emerges. This case sits squarely in that space. Haminit Lee's death remains the constant. She is still 18. Her life is still cut short. The passage of time does not change that fact. Legal corrections do not restore what was lost. What the case ultimately reveals is not a clear answer, but a boundary. A point where confidence exceeds evidence. Where interpretation becomes certainty without sufficient warning. The crime does not make sense because the available facts do not resolve it. The conviction once made sense because a final detail appeared to do that work. When that detail is stripped of its authority, the clarity dissolves.